What's been really great has been being able to look back at difficult times in my life and start to recognize, oh, I was struggling then with this because of the ADHD. And I'm able to look at my family history and look at my family and recognize that ADHD is genetic, so it is very likely that I come from a neurospicy family. Hello and welcome to Divergent Paths. I'm your host, Dr. Regina McMenomy. I am a doctor, but not that kind of doctor. And this is a podcast, not medical advice. Have you always felt a little different, but didn't know why? Have you struggled with tasks that some people seem to handle with ease? Are you sometimes mystified by social norms and interactions with other people? Divergent Paths is a podcast for late diagnosed neurodivergent people to discuss their journeys discovering the joys and frustrations of having a spicy brain. Each episode, I will interview someone who discovered they have ADHD, autism, or a combination of the two later in life. What defines a later in life diagnosis? Anytime the realization happens outside of the quote-unquote norm of childhood and adolescence. For this episode, as the first episode, my longtime friend Russ interviews me about my own diagnosis. So stay tuned to learn about my awkward journey, and thanks for listening to Divergent Paths.
Have you given history of us? We've known each other since forever ago.
We have known each other since forever ago.
Did you mention original cookie in the open?
I don't think I did mention original cookie in the open. We can talk about it though. Russ and I met at our very first job in the mall when we were teenagers.
Did. And you wanted to fire me, but
I did.
That's how it goes.
And you crushed a sugar cookie and put it down my shirt one day.
Yeah.
When we were fighting.
This was before HR existed. This was long ago.
This was when they let two 16-year-olds run the whole store.
Right.
Which, in hindsight, probably wasn't the best idea. It was just the two of us.
That was not wise. I don't know what they were thinking. But, hey, whatever.
I mean...
It survived. It's not there anymore, and the whole mall is going to be demolished, but... Yes. So, okay, I know. I feel like everything about you. Or at least almost everything about you.
Yes.
But the listeners do not. So tell us a little about yourself.
All right. Well, let's see. I am an academic. I have a Ph.D. in American Studies, and I studied gender and video games. And you may be coming to this podcast having checked out my previous podcast, which was called Game on Girl, which was based on my dissertation research. And I did that podcast for many years. There are many episodes, and they're all still available if you're interested in going back into that. And that was where really my love of podcasting came from, launching that show. And the reason why I launched that show was because when I finished my PhD, I decided I didn't want to be an academic in a traditional sense anymore. But I still wanted to have conversations about the research that I had done and the sort of identity conversations that had started through my research. And that was kind of where I started podcasting. I just decided that the conversations were valuable and I wanted to have a bigger audience than I would have if I took a traditional academic path. Because when you take an academic path, you spend a lot of your time talking to other academics.
Right.
And I felt like what I had to say was really more important than a conversation that would have happened with, 50 to 100 people across the world. I wanted it to have a bigger impact. And so that's how Game on Girl was born. And I've kind of evolved away from gaming as a core part of my identity. At the time I was writing the dissertation, I was playing World of Warcraft, and that's what inspired me to pursue that topic. And I'd always been a video gamer trying to remember if we ever played video games together. I don't think we did.
I don't
Didn't
think
do a whole
so.
lot
No,
of video games in high school, as I
we
remember.
did like plenty of board games.
We did lots of board games, yes.
Yeah,
And that's what I play now more than anything. I have a rather extensive collection of board games. I generally am traveling with a handful of board games everywhere I
nice.
go. And that's more where my focus is.
Why do you think that changed?
I think part of it was the dissertation, honestly,
Mhm.
and doing the podcast and having that focus last for so long, so intensely. I think that I just kind of moved into a space where it became a little bit too much work and not as much play.
Mm-hmm.
I had to keep up on game releases, and people were always asking me questions about it. And there's so much to know about video games and so many different games that I just never really played, that it just became something that wasn't an interest for me to keep up with. So in some of the language that I would use to talk about it now is my hyper focus on video games ended. And part of that was life. Part of it was dissertation and topic and having talked about it for so long. But I became a mom, and sitting at my computer became harder when I was a mom, for hours on
Right.
end.
Yeah.
Board games are a lot more accessible to small humans. And so that kind of pivoted in that direction, because that could be an activity that I could still game and enjoy, that with my daughter. And I also changed jobs as well in all of
Right.
this. I have had all these major life changes. And when I started working at my desk 40 hours a week,
Do
sitting
you
at
really
my
want to be
desk,
there playing games?
exactly,
Yeah.
for leisure time didn't really have the same appeal anymore.
Right.
So I just kind of slowly moved away from it. Like, I think the last thing I had done that was big is I got like one of the expansions for World of Warcraft, thinking I was going to go back in and play again. And to really seriously play those games is such a time commitment.
Totally. Totally. I mean, like, I enjoy Minecraft, like just
Right.
building stuff in Minecraft,
Mm-hmm.
but it takes forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it's like I'll start it and then it's like, okay, I got to put this away. I got to
Right.
stop because
Yeah.
I just, get so into it. I don't know if I would call it hyper focus,
No.
but I do feel like it's like, it's like this need for, getting it done, this like
Right.
accomplishment thing where it's like, I've got to get to the end of it.
Right.
When you just said hyper focus, and I was
Yeah.
thinking about like what you were talking about changing your career and, doing the academic thing. And then,
Yeah.
okay, well, that changed and there's something else there. I think about, I host a business podcast, and there's so many people that I've talked to that are hyper focused on their business.
Right.
Are they hyper focused or are they super goal oriented to get the thing done? How do you
How
differentiate
do you differentiate?
those two things?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the first thing I'm going to say is, are they neurospicy? Like,
Oh no.
if
Okay. What is neurospicy? I need to get into that.
so if they have a neurodivergence, if they have ADHD or autism or something along the lines that makes their brain work differently, that is a different thing than being goal oriented. And when you have a brain that allows you to focus for extended periods of time to your physical detriment. So I would ask you, like, when you're playing Minecraft and you're in that space, do you forget to eat?
I don't.
Okay, then that's not hyper focus.
I'm usually eating while I'm doing it.
Well,
So
I mean, well, then that isn't. I don't know. Like, I will, if I get caught up, if I am in a project, if I'm writing in particular, if I'm
Mhm.
writing and I get in the zone and I am producing words, I will forget all other bodily functions, all other things I need to do to care for myself. I just get to a place where that's all I see. And that can happen anywhere. I hyper focused on cleaning last week, and I cleaned like a good portion of my house because that's just where my hyper focus went. Had music on in my AirPods and just went forward and cleaned. And that comes from my ADHD.
right. I I feel like in a way, that can be a superpower, the hyper focused, right? Like you can take on a task and
Hmm.
just like
Yeah. Drive
like
it.
the painting, right? And
Hmm.
just go for it.
Hmm.
It's like flying, it's like the
Yeah.
expressway. Do you ever look at it like a superpower?
I look at it as a very unique talent. I don't really like the idea of a superpower because I can't always control it. Like
Gotcha.
the day that I cleaned the house, I didn't decide that that
Right.
was going to be the
Right.
hyper focus for that day. And I don't have a lot of control over it. I can sometimes set myself up with rituals that will get me into a space where I can access it.
Mhm.
But it's not a switch that I can turn on and off. And that's why, like, if you want to use the metaphor of flying, superheroes that fly can just jump off the ground and fly, right? Like anytime they want to. But I can't always jump off the ground and hyper focus on what I want to hyper focus on.
Gotcha.
And that makes it, that's where it starts to come into me understanding it more as it is an amazing ability, and when I can put it where it needs to be and where I need it to be, it's a beautiful thing. But the rest of the time it is a struggle.
When did you first like suspect that you were well, I'll use your neurospicy term. I like
Yes.
that.
Yeah. I started to suspect I was neurospicy probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was really kind of funny because it was a very indirect route for me to take. I had some friends who started posting memes about ADHD. And I'm like, oh, that's funny. I do that,
Mm.
but that doesn't mean I have ADHD. That's funny. I don't, you know, but I don't have ADHD because I wrote a dissertation. I can focus with no problem. Like I focus all the time. I wrote a book. I have multiple college degrees. I, can do all of these things, so I just didn't. At first I was like, this is weird. Like, why am I resonating with this?
Right.
And then dismissed it. This can't be who I am. And then, and then I joined TikTok,
Oh,
and
right.
the TikTok algorithm was very sure that I had ADHD.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And I started getting presented video after video after video of, things that ADHD people do that are not necessarily like, that are not neurotypical, just like some of these things. And I started going, wait, what?
Right.
Yes.
Probably I'm gonna say TikTok is probably not the best official diagnosis.
TikTok is not an official diagnosis. And in addition, this is not this conversation is not a place of diagnosis. I am not that kind of doctor. I cannot look at the spot on your leg and tell you anything about it.
Right, right.
I can help you talk about your identity and how you formed it and what it means, but those are not the same things. But yeah,
So what do you do if you start to suspect and somebody that's listening to this podcast is
right.
probably thinking like, "Oh, well, I
Maybe
have
you're
these
right.
traits."
Right.
How
Yeah.
do you get or when did actually let's talk about your official diagnosis. Did
My
you
official
did you
diagnosis. Yeah.
did you get one?
I did get an official diagnosis, yes.
Okay.
I did pursue that after it's been a year, just over a year since I got my official diagnosis. And part of my process was learning that ADHD presents differently in assigned female birth bodies. So it doesn't look the same.
Hmm.
And much of the research that has been done on assigned male at birth bodies. So the physical hyperactivity, because I was one of the, I don't have ADHD, I can sit still,
But
because
different because the
yeah,
research was done on some yeah, okay.
exactly. So
Mhm.
I do not have physical manifestations of ADHD. I can sit still. I don't tap my feet. I don't like, my hyperactivity is all internal. It's all in my mind. And I ended up reading a book called Divergent Minds, and I probably should have looked the author's name up, but I'll have it in the show notes. And I read that book, and it was talking about how autism and ADHD present differently in assigned female birth bodies. And that is a big piece of that is the way the hyperactivity is internalized. So it is a completely internal process.
What's the steps towards the diagnosis? Like, what did you do
What did
in
I
order
do
to,
to get the official
yeah,
diagnosis?
like what's
Yeah.
the, is it a test? Is it like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So I would like to acknowledge my absolute privilege in this process. At the time I decided to seek out the diagnosis, I had absolutely outstanding medical insurance.
Mm,
And so I didn't have to go to my primary care doctor to get a referral for the testing, which is a process that people often have to do because
right.
I had insurance where I could pick my providers. So I was able just to find an organization. There's an office in my town that does nothing but this kind of assessment. That's all their office does. And I was able to find them. I was able to, book an appointment. I was able to pay a nominal copayment for what turned out to be 3 different appointments. So the first appointment, I went in and I met with the person who would be administering the test, and they have kind of a battery of initial consultation questions so that they can suss out if you are showing signs of the neurodivergence. So, it was questions like, do you lose your car keys a lot? And my answer to that was no. And then she backed up and said, well, is that because you have a system to keep track of where your car keys are? Do you have a system in place so you don't lose your car keys? And I said, yes, I do. I also have a system in place so I don't misplace my phone. I have a system in place so that I know where, my purse is at all times. Like, there are things that are, I was already accommodating my ADHD without knowing that that's what I was doing. And I
Right.
had done that a lot. So the initial consultation was, kind of this battery of tests. It asked questions about my childhood, leaning back to, because that's one of the criteria, is that this is something that you also had in your childhood and was something that you, kind of evolved with.
It's funny how you mentioned the symptom thing of like you just sort of made up for it. You
Yeah,
sort of just, it's like somebody like with with like a physical symptom of like, oh, well, it hurts when I stand up and I
right,
do this.
right,
So I just don't do that anymore.
exactly.
It doesn't mean you're getting rid of the problem. It
Yeah.
just means you're, putting it's a duct tape solution in a in a way.
It is. And
Yeah.
that's what I think the majority of people who go undiagnosed do.
Right.
They, or don't do or can't do. Like
Right.
I was very capable of somehow figuring out how to amend my disability with this because I was
Right.
able to build structures, to figure out ways to trick myself, to gamify things. I gamified my dissertation. I, gave
Hmm.
myself rewards at certain points, and I used what's called the Pomodoro method, where you work for 25 minutes and then take a 5-minute break.
Right.
And, talked about my dissertation as making salsa because I was smashing tomatoes. And that's, and it made it fun, like it, and then it engaged part of that ADHD brain. I'd also say, and I want to get back to I don't want to lose track of finishing the story of getting the official diagnosis, because this is ADHD at its finest right here. Um,
I did that one. That was me.
right.
Wanted to dig in deeper there.
Right. So like being able to do that is also, it doesn't work for everybody. Like not everybody who has ADHD has the capacity to kind of figure out how to manipulate it when they don't know what's going on.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I read the book, I did the initial consultation, I went back in for both testing for autism and ADHD because if you don't know, they are very closely related to each other. And I was in my initial consult showing things that might have proven out to be autism as well. The schedule for the testing is 6 hours long, or was at least for me. It's a 6 hour long series of tests that you take. So essentially, you clear out an entire day. It took a couple months to be able to schedule it because, like, they have
Right.
a lot of people wanting these, and it's a long process.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
And with you're not supposed to have any caffeine the day that you go in for the test because you were supposed to go in with no stims, no stimulants. So
Right.
so you're not supposed to have any caffeine. And then you go in and you take the battery of tests, and it was very extensive. There are tests for executive functioning, like how you make decisions. There's tests for working memory, so how you hold things in your memory. And that was for me, that was an uncomfortable test because it was partially she would tell me a series of numbers and I would have to repeat the numbers. And at first you just repeat them in what order she told them to me. But then it was repeat them in ascending order and then repeat them in descending order. And so you had to remember the numbers and reorganize them.
Mm.
It was hard.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. There was also a test for like knowing definitions of words, which I went through, and I think there was one
Hmm.
word that I didn't actually know the dictionary definition of, just one
Okay.
of like 30
Wow.
words. So yeah, and there were tests with blocks where I had to put the blocks into the pattern that was on a piece of paper, like manipulate them to make them the thing. And it was funny because when I finished it, especially that one, I wanted to do it again because I knew if I did it again, I would ace it. Like,
Right.
because I was laying the pathways, and I knew once the pathways were there, it's like every time I play a new board game, I want to play it twice immediately. Like I want to play it once, and I want to play it again immediately after because I know that like by the end of the game, things have clicked into place that weren't there in the beginning. Right.
Right. You feel like you figured it out.
Right.
Now let me
And now let me
perfect
show you
it.
what I can really do. But that's not how these tests work because I didn't get to do
Right.
them. So we were at about 4 hours. I had done all the ADHD tests and had done 2 of 3 autism tests. And the last 2 hours was very extensive autism test. And she said, currently you're not showing positive for autism. So I will let you choose. Like, do you want to do this test or do you want to skip this? And I said, well, if we're currently showing no on this, let's just not do it for now.
And let's go
So
back to that game so I can finish it.
right, exactly. Go back to that so I can play it properly now.
Right.
So from there, she took my testing and then presented it to 3 psychologists who then conferred on my results and wrote up a report for me. And then I went back in for an hour-long conversation with one of the psychologists to get the results of my assessment. And
Question on that. So, I mean,
uh,
I'm assuming, there's various details that we'll get into, but is it like, are they ranking this? Is it like a scored
kind of,
test?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're this
It's a
is your
diagnosis.
ADHD score.
Yes.
You are 90% or,
Right.
whatever it is.
Yeah. So
Okay.
there's an overall diagnosis that you get. There are 3 main types of diagnostic outcomes you can have when you go through the process. There is hyperactive ADHD, there's inattentive ADHD, and then there's combined, which is when you have both inattentive and hyperactive. And I have the combined type. So I have both inattentive and hyperactive ADHD. And I don't remember all of the different criteria, but there is in the results and the report that I got, there's a table that shows where my flags are, like where my big problems are. And at the top were issues with executive functioning, which is how you make decisions, and working memory, which I told you was that test that I hated so much.
Hmm.
The one where you have to hold the numbers in your mind and then rearrange them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I knew that was terrible because it hurt.
Right. Yeah, I
It
can see
hurt
that.
my brain.
Thinking about it, I'm like, oh wow.
Right? Yeah, it's
Right.
uncomfortable to think about, and it's it's
Uh-huh.
performative because you're doing it in front of somebody.
Totally. Totally. I mean,
But go ahead. What was that?
well, I was just gonna say it's like, like I do improv, as you
Right.
know,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll play these like alphabet scenes. And as you're doing it, you're having to remember the scene, but you're having to remember which letter you're on in the
Right.
alphabet. And it is intentionally hard,
Yes.
you know,
Right.
to
Yes.
do this. And it's just I can't now I'm thinking, well, what if I had to rearrange the alphabet too? You know, or do it in Latin
Right.
and then change it to the Greek alphabet or whatever,
Right.
What?
Or what
You
if
can't do that.
you'd played you did that and you did it backwards and you started with Z and you had to work your way back,
Yeah, exactly,
right?
right?
Like, and that's exactly it. Like, we don't, those are not comfortable. Like, where, your brain wants things to be easy.
Right,
So it wants
right,
pathways that are clear and straightforward, all brains.
totally.
But yeah.
Well, and what I'm getting, I guess the point I'm trying to make there too is that it's something like that number test could be hard for everyone,
Right.
and there's sometimes, they'll show some like they'll take a snippet of that test, throw it online, and it's like, oh, if you can't do this, you have ADHD.
Right.
And I think I'm just, I guess, saying this because the self-diagnosis is always like a scary thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's great. I love what you did here. 3 sessions, 6 hours, three, people reviewing the results. Like
Yep.
all of that is great. I mean,
Yes.
but also, like you said, very privileged, right?
Yes.
Like, I mean, it's not out there everywhere. Unfortunately, they don't,
It's not.
prioritize mental health in this country or many other countries.
Right. Yeah.
Instead, they treat it like this thing that's not really there because I guess people don't see it,
Right, exactly, because
right? It's
it
like
is an invisible disability, and it is a thing that, like, nobody's gonna look at me and think that I have a disability. Like, that's not how that's gonna work, and it has been a journey for me to accept that about myself, even to look at my life, where I am a successful person, right? Like, I have had lots of great success. And even the day when I walked in to get the assessment feedback with the psychologist, I walked in the door and he's like, I am so excited to talk to you. And I was like,
mm,
okay. Like, he's like, we generally don't have people your age come in here to get assessed, have the level of ADHD you have, the depth of ADHD you have, and have multiple college degrees and are holding a high level position in a job. Usually
mm,
people who have not been diagnosed by your age are struggling significantly more than you are.
mm.
And so that was really fascinating. And so he's like, I want to know all about you. I want to know how you did this, because it's really fascinating for me to look at your history and think that you were doing this up against amazing odds. He's like, can you imagine what would have happened had you had support for your disability instead of
Right.
been fighting in many ways against it? If I wasn't having to constantly play those games to trick myself into having hyper focus, into gamifying things. And I have sat with that, and that was a hard truth. I cried in the parking lot. I recorded a TikTok immediately after getting the results, talking about the fact that like my working memory is 93% worse than most people's is, like, than
Wow.
most neurotypical people. So, like, that is significant, right? And trying to kind of come around to wrapping my head around, like, okay, what might have been like. And I am still on the fence as to whether the fact that I had to personally work against it was part of what drove me. Like, I don't know if it was or not. I have no idea what it would be like to have support. because I didn't have that.
Right.
I know now what it's like to be medicated, and I choose this life. Because to be on ADHD medication was a revolution for me.
Do you still find yourself playing those games?
Yeah.
Do you recognize it and appreciate it and just go for it? Or do you recognize it and say, okay, I got to change this. I don't want to do that game. Like, what's that like now?
It's easier. Like the get up and go to get things done, it doesn't take quite as much manipulation for me to get into a space of activity or to get tasks done or to address things. One of the things that's really hard about ADHD in general is my brain just sees everything at once, right? And so every time I do a task, I don't just see, like I walk into my kitchen to clean it or walk into my kitchen in the morning, I don't just see, oh, those dishes need to be done. I see those dishes need to be done. This needs to be put away. This needs to be done. I need to make breakfast. I need to do this. I need to make lunch for my daughter. I need to do all of these different things. Like they all hit me at once. And
Mm.
one of the things that's hard about ADHD is you have to prioritize which tasks to do in what order. And that was a really hard thing to do when I was unmedicated. Now that I'm medicated, I don't have as much difficulty going, okay, you need to get the dishes out of the sink before you make food. Whatever it is that needs to be done, like I can put those things in order in a much
Nice.
easier way. So the metaphor I say is like, excuse me, I still have a collection of squirrels that are running around in my brain all the time that are like bouncing, but I can get them in line.
You've trained the squirrels. You're like Mark Rober.
I've trained the
Yeah.
squirrels. Like the medication trains the squirrels. The medication gets the squirrels in order. And then I can say, okay, you are the one I need to do first. And we need to do this because the medication has kind of helps rewire and change my brain. So much of my life changed when I went on the medication. I stopped drinking caffeine. I cut back on alcohol consumption because the medication regulated my nervous system in a way that I never had it regulated. And I didn't recognize how dysregulated I was because I had always been dysregulated.
Right.
And then I started to become regulated and I'm like, oh, all of these coping mechanisms I had dysregulated my body. And I was okay with that because I was always in a state of dysregulation.
In that state that you've always been in, you were able to accomplish so much. And you know, that's physician backed that you've accomplished a lot.
Right.
He also said it.
Right.
But
Yeah.
you've done all these great things. Do you now look back and be like, well, if I would have got this diagnosis at, 16 instead of last or 2 years ago,
Yeah.
what would my life be like?
I try not to think about it that way. I try not to put myself in a what could have been mindset because it's not necessarily productive for me.
Right.
What's been really great has been being able to look back at difficult times in my life and start to recognize, oh, I was struggling then with this because of the ADHD. And oh, I had difficulty managing this because of the disability. And I'm able to look at my family history and look at my family and recognize that ADHD is genetic. So it is very likely that I come from a neurospicy family. And when I look at some of the struggles that I didn't understand my brothers in particular having, I can look at all that in a different light now. And I'm like, well, of course they had this
Right.
because they didn't know that they had ADHD.
Totally.
And so I am hoping, and one of the reasons why I saw it, I had people ask me, they're like, why are you doing this now? Like, you are successful. You have this, you have this, you have this. Why are you doing this? And it's like, well, this is genetic. So if I am passing this on in my family line, I want my daughter to know, I want her to understand where I'm coming from. I want her to figure out if she falls in these categories too, which she likely does. And she is very desirous right now of getting assessed and finding out if she has ADHD, which we haven't quite figured out the path for that yet. But that will put her on a very different trajectory. So like, I can stand here as kind of this bridge from like my family, who were all undiagnosed, to me, who got late diagnosed, to the next generation of my family who will have this knowledge and understanding and the resources and the abilities to potentially have a different life, because I made the decision to pursue this and had the privilege to be able to pursue it, the diagnosis now.
What you're saying there, I'm so glad you're not saying, oh well, my whole life would have changed and this would have happened now.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that you're just thinking about the future and the next generation and how you can help. And I feel like you're doing that at home, but you're also doing that on this podcast.
Exactly. That's exactly what the drive of this is to help.
So what can people expect? Let's kind of set up. I mean, hey, this is the first episode. I only get to be here for this one, so I got to learn. I'm going to become a listener, or tell me about the podcast so
Yes.
that so that I listen to every single episode.
Yeah. So what I want to do with Divergent Paths is interview female identified or non-binary people who have a late diagnosis of ADHD, autism, and neurodivergence, and tell those stories. Like, I want these stories to be told. I want, because it was so important to me that the people who posted on TikTok who opened my mind. I mean, even the memes that started this 5 or 6 years ago,
Right.
even those are just people, talking about their experiences. And I think that there's a lot of really valuable conversations that can be had about this. And, we do experience it differently. I have, identified at least a few of my friends who now know that they are, also neurospicy and have probably ADHD. And I will get dismissive comments from them sometimes, people who haven't gone through the process of getting diagnosed, who will say things like, well, my ADHD isn't as severe as yours is, or things like that. Well, I don't really need to get a diagnosis because, I can manage this. And I'm sitting on the other side of the diagnosis, of the medication, of a year of, knowing and saying, you don't know. Like, I did not know how noisy my brain was. Like, I didn't know. Like, my anxiety dropped so much when I went on the ADHD medication, which is the opposite of what stims are supposed to do. Like, right, stimulants are supposed to amp people up. And it just ramped the noise in my brain down so much that I still marvel sometimes at the fact that, like, it's quieter. It's not silent. I still get songs stuck in my head that play for days sometimes, but I don't wake up every morning with a song in my head going, where did this song come from? Why am I, why is this song playing, or what, whatever these like things are. I don't spiral out of control anxiety on every thought I had. And it was every thought. I could spiral on everything. Like, any thought in my head, I could just wind up and up and up and up. And by the end of the day, I was exhausted because I had,
Right.
all of these squirrels in my head running around with all these different ideas.
Right.
I'm still exhausted at the end of the day. I am mom to a 10-year-old and I'm 50. So, oh yeah. A 10-year-old I love very much.
I almost feel like you should name the podcast Train the Squirrels. Yeah, I think you've set up something here for
I may need to put a squirrel in the logo.
Exactly.
Well, I just found out last night that one of the symbols for ADHD is a rainbow butterfly. And I love the idea of that, the idea of something that's always in motion, that doesn't stop, that has, amazingly beautiful colors, that goes through a massive transformation. At least that's what part of this has felt like this has transformed my life, this knowledge. So
I think you've got your cover art set up now.
Yeah, definitely might be that might come up. I have a couple of different ideas. We're working on the logo right now. So, and I am going to launch this into, this is going to be a podcast to talk to people, but I also want to make this into my next phase of my career, to start a consulting business where I can hopefully enact some change and help people who have invisible disabilities understand themselves, have people who love people with invisible disabilities understand them maybe a little better as well. And open that up potentially to working with companies to help them understand what it means to have employees that have these kinds of divergence and these neurodivergence and these spicy brains, because spicy brains are amazing. There's so much potential. There's so much good work. I know that my ability as a teacher directly comes from my ADHD. It comes from that ability to assess. There were years ago, I completely ditched every lesson plan I ever had. Like 10 years into teaching, just threw it to the wind. And I would go in to class and I would figure out where my students were and I would figure out what they needed. And I didn't drop the goals and I didn't drop, what needed to be taught. But I started teaching in a way that spoke to my students as opposed to me having an agenda for them. And that was such a pivotal moment for me to realize that I could shape what I needed to teach them based on what and how they needed. No two of my classes after that point were ever the same. And I called it my choose your own adventure, learning strategy.
Okay. Nice.
I'm hoping to take all of that kind of energy into this invisible disability space.
And create some classes and courses as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
Yeah.
So it's the beginning of a journey.
It's the beginning. It's the beginning of my divergent path.
Thanks for allowing me to be a part of that. It's so cool to be in the beginning here.
Yes, you get to be here from the start to see where all of this goes from.
So I will be listening. I'll be editing, actually. I'll be
You will be editing. You're going to be involved.
Yeah, so all those bad edits. That would be me.
So anytime anybody who comes on the show who's mad about how they sound, I will send you to Russ.
This is your guy right here.
Thank you so much for listening to my story. I am so excited to bring my story and many like it to this podcast. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, like and leave a review, and share with your spicy brain friends. Follow us on Instagram at Divergent Paths Consulting, no spaces. And until next time, stay spicy.